Asia and the Indian physician. Another piece of evidence adduced for Indian or Buddhist influences on early Islam is a brief tradition about Muhammad's wife Aisha, who, according to reports, was treated by a physician of the Jats, who originated from India. Known in Arabic as Zut, the ancestors of these people had reportedly been moved to the Persian Gulf in Sasanian times, as early as 2 centuries before the emergence of. Although nobody seems to suggest that the Zut were Buddhists, their presence on the western shores of the Arabian Peninsula, in the Hijaz, would allow for the argument that the Prophet Muhammad could indeed have had contact with Indians who may have retained their own religious traditions. The report about Aisha and the Zut physician is cited by Alexander Berzin, M.K. Agarwal, Karim Taysero and the authors of numerous websites. What appears to be the source of this story among modern authors can be found in al-Bukhari's collection of hadiths about Muslim manners, Al-Adab al-Mufrad, where it is listed in the chapter on selling a slave from the Arabs. The full text is as follows. I was told by Sulayman ibn Harb on the authority of Hamid ibn Zayd on the authority of Yahya ibn Said on the authority of Ibn Amara on the authority of Amara. Aisha, may God be pleased with her, manumitted a female slave. Aisha then began to complain of an illness and her nephew consulted a doctor who belonged to the Zut. The doctor told him, "You have described a bewitched woman who was bewitched by a female slave of hers." Aisha was informed about this and asked, "Did you bewitch me?" The female slave responded, "Yes." Aisha inquired, "But why? You are never going to be saved." Then she said, "Sell her to the worst slaveholders among the Arabs." Berzin and other authors cite the report as evidence that Muhammad was familiar with Indian culture. Others recognize a sign of respect for Indian learning. Like any historical source, however, it requires critical scrutiny, for the story about Aisha's Indian physician is anything but straightforward. As already discussed, the Islamic tradition preserves a great wealth of information about the earliest days of the religion's history, the life of the Prophet Muhammad, his family and companions. Accordingly, in 1851, Ernest Renan declared confidently that Islam had emerged in the full light of history. The historical reliability of these sources, however, has now come under great scrutiny as part of revisionist critique. Hadith and Sirah are increasingly analyzed as products of 8th and 9th century religious and political thought, rather than repositories of early 7th century traditions. As such, they reflect the religious, political and cultural concerns of the time in which they were compiled, although these are in some cases more obvious than in others. What then of al-Bukhari's hadith about Aisha and her Indian physician? First of all, Muhammad al-Bukhari hailed from eastern Iran and spent most of his life there, although as a young man he went to the Hijaz on pilgrimage. He was born in 194,810 and thus lived more than 2 centuries after Muhammad. Even though al-Bukhari is famed for his brilliant memory, the chronological and geographical distance to early 7th century Western Arabia alone should raise doubt concerning his reliability as a source for that history, rather than his own. Disciplines of oral and written transmission can be traced into the 8th century, but not back to the early 7th. Was there, then, any reason for al-Bukhari to invent the story about Aisha and the Zut physician? Indeed, what is the point of the story and its significance in the tradition? It does not seem to be the physician who merely diagnoses Aisha's illness as bewitchment. The point rather seems to be the status of the slave. More specifically, her condition is deferred manumission, which occurred upon the owner's death. In legal terminology, such a slave is accordingly called a mudabbar. Aisha's female Mudabar slave apparently sought to expedite her manumission by killing her owner through magical means. Aisha, also reported elsewhere as having manumitted slaves, decides to punish her would-be murderer by selling her to a harsh slaveholder. It is this point which was of interest to the legal scholars and thus explains the rationale of the tradition. Can a slave whose manumission has already been decided still be sold? And what of a slave who attempts to speed up the procedure? Does that void the tadbir? The Syrian Hanbali scholar Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya affirmed this, although it was only the modern editor who referred to the Aisha story in Al-Adab al-Mufrad as a parallel. In pre-modern Arabic literature, the hadith does not seem to appear very frequently. Interestingly, variations of the same story appear in other collections of traditions, but the specific identification of the physician as a member of the Zut seems particular to al-Bukhari. Two other collections of hadiths will be discussed here in order to illustrate the complexity of the issue. A generation before al-Bukhari, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the eponym of the Hanbali school of law, compiled his own selection of hadiths in his Musnad. Although Ahmad's family had a connection with Khorasan, he was born and spent most of his life in Iraq. In Ahmad's version, the story is as follows. Sufyan told us on the authority of Ya'ni on the authority of Ibn Aki Amra, I don't know this one or the other one, on the authority of Amra. She said, Aisha was suffering an illness and the illness prolonged. A man who practiced medicine came to Medina, and her nephew sought him out in order to ask him about her ailment. He said, By God, you offer the description of a woman who has been bewitched. He said, This is a bewitched woman who has been bewitched by a female slave of hers. She said, Yes, I wanted you to die so that I will be freed. He explained, She was a Mudabar. She said, Sell her to the worst slaveholders among the Arabs and set her price accordingly. This version of the tradition confirms that the point of the story is the condition of the Mudabar slave rather than the identity of the physician. In Ahmad's variant, the physician comes from outside of Medina, but no details about his provenance are provided. The Indian connection is thus marginal, as far as the perspective of the tradition is concerned. Given that Ahmad lived a generation before al-Bukhari, it is reasonable to speculate that the later scholar changed some of the terms, such as matbaba to majra, more unambiguously evoking magic, and added the detail about the physician's identity. The association between magic and India became common in Islamic literature. One may surmise that the Indian connection was added when India had become synonymous with magic and Arabia had receded into a background. The third source is the earliest collection of hadith, the Muwatta of Malik ibn Anas, eponym of the Maliki school of law. Malik died in 179,796 in his mid to late 80s in Medina, which was the center of his life. Unfortunately for our purposes, the transmission history of his Muwatta is very complicated. The text is preserved in several recensions that differ significantly, as Jonathan Broskop points out. An examination of 6 of the published versions of the Muwatta reveals the very wide discrepancies which would be expected for a text that developed organically. 2 of these recensions, those by al-Saybani and Ibn Wahb, differ so drastically from the Vulgate recension of Ya'ya al-Laythi that they might be considered entirely different texts. Among the 3 recensions consulted for this article, those by al-Shaybani and Abu Musab al-Zuri contain the story about Aisha and the Indian, here, Sindhi, physician, whereas the most widely spread recension of the Muwatta, which is Ya'ya's, does not. This is not the place to delve into the intricacies of the history of the Muwatta. Suffice it to say that the story about Aisha and the Indian physician was indeed older than al-Bukhari, since it appears in Abu Musab al-Zuri's recension, although his contemporary Ahmad did not include it in his own collection of hadiths. Given the discrepancies between the recensions, we cannot assume that the inclusion of the story dates back to Malik ibn Anas himself. It is worth noting that the version of the story in the two recensions of the Muwatta consulted for this article differs from what we can find in al-Adab al-Mufrad. The following is attributed to Malik by al-Shaybani and Abu Musab. Abu Musab reported to us on the authority of Malik, on the authority of Abu al-Riyal Muhammad ibn Abd al-Rahman, on the authority of his mother Amra about Aisha, may God be pleased with her. Aisha undertook to manumit a female slave who would gain her freedom after Aisha's death. Then, Aisha became ill as God willed. An Indian visited her and told her that she had been bewitched. She inquired, "And who bewitched me?" He responded, "A woman who is so and so," and added that in her lap is a boy who has just urinated. Aisha said, "Get me the so and so, who was a slave of hers who served her." They found her in the house of her neighbors with a boy in her lap who had just urinated. Aisha commanded that she should wash away the urine of that boy, and the woman cleaned herself and came to Aisha. Aisha asked her, "Did you bewitch me?" She responded, "Yes." Aisha inquired, "And why?" The woman answered, "Because I want to be freed." Aisha said, "You wanted to be freed, but by God, you will never be freed." Aisha instructed her nephew to sell her to the worst slaveholder among the Arabs and said, "And then use the money from the sale to purchase a slave girl so that I may free her." He followed her instructions. In this version, the element of magic is enhanced even further. The Indian doctor has information about facts beyond his sense perception. In order to analyze this story more fully, the prominent presence of magic and its association with India would need to be taken into account. Either way, the story does not hold up as evidence for Muhammad's familiarity with Buddhism or India in general. Here again, modern authors affirm tradition while challenging tradition. The hadith is evoked without any source criticism and used in order to make a larger case for an Indian presence not acknowledged by the tradition. An obvious challenge to theories about Buddhist influences on early Islam is that such a Buddhist presence has left no discernible trace in the Quran. Marcus Gross has argued that Surah 109 betrays Buddhist influences, but he relies on a rereading of the Arabic text as well as on a very general structural argument. There are, to be sure, a number of attempts, especially in the context of interreligious dialogue, to demonstrate that Quranic and Buddhist values are compatible or even identical. This, however, is very different from a historical argument that stipulates a Buddhist influence on Muhammad or on the Quran. The most prominent theory was presented by Hamid Abd al-Qadir in his The Life and Philosophy of the Buddha, a book frequently mentioned but hardly ever cited. The author is adduced to suggest that the Quranic character Hu al-Kifil is actually the Buddha, the name reflecting his birthplace capital of Astu, a view expressed by others as well, such as Mirza Tahir Ahmad, leader of the Ahmadiyya, while the origins of this figure remain controversial. There is no indication other than the popular etymology that Hu al-Kifil might be inspired by an Indian tradition. Most theories revolve around Jewish and biblical roots. In a less controversial area, W.H. Siddiqui lists words of Indian origin in the Quran. While most modern scholars will find such etymologies unpersuasive, M.K. Agarwal invokes an authority which lends these explanations greater weight than they might usually be credited with. Al-Biruni has noted that the Arabs changed Sanskrit names into Arabic to camouflage the real origin. Elsewhere, the author elaborates, to usurp non-Greek knowledge, Greek-sounding names were invented by Latin translators of Arabic texts, just as Sanskrit names were changed into Arabic by Arabs who had manipulated Sanskrit names. Al-Biruni notes that the name Aryabhata was changed to Arjabad and later to Asjabar, so Hindus will not recognize it. The passage in question can be found in Al-Biruni's famous book on India, but it hardly bears out the implication of deliberate disfiguration of Indian origins. In Sachau's translation, the medieval author makes the following observation: "We meet in this context with a curious circumstance. Evidently Al-Fazari and Jaqub sometimes heard from their Hindu masters expressions to this effect, that his calculation of the star cycles was that of the great Siddhanta, whilst Aryabhata reckoned with 1,000th part of it. They apparently did not understand him properly, and imagined that Aryabhata, Arab, Arjabad, meant 1,000th part. The Hindus pronounce the D of this word something between a D and an R. So the consonant became changed to an R, and people wrote Arjabar. Afterwards it was still more mutilated, the first R being changed to a Z, and so people wrote Asjabar. If the word in this garb wanders back to the Hindus, they will not recognize it. Seizing this as carte blanche, Agarwal and other authors present a wide range of Arabic etymologies that are meant to reflect Indian origins. The name of the month Ramadan, for example, is allegedly derived from the Indian deity Rama. Muslim-Buddhist contacts in the formative period. No matter how present Buddhist elements may have been in the Middle East and Arabia at the eve of Islam and during the period of the religion's emergence, there is little doubt that during the formative period of Islamic history Muslims became more exposed to Buddhism and gained greater knowledge of this tradition. Daniel Guimarães' article of 1969 still serves as a useful survey on the subject. To mention but some of the most prominent cases, the Fihriст, the thematic catalogue of books compiled by Ibn al-Nadim in the 10th century in Iraq, includes a number of relevant details, such as the Book of Balawar wa Buddha Saif, about which more below, and various references to Buddhism in the sections on India and China. In the 9th chapter, he describes several objects and practices of worship in India and China as well as several beliefs, among them those of the Shamanaya. This group, also known as Humanaya, is associated in various ways with Buddhism, although a discussion of the Sumanaya is beyond the scope of this. The Sumanaya as well as the Barahima, likewise connected to India, entered the orbit of Islamic philosophy, theology and even legal sciences as deniers of prophecy. They are also said to have denied that multiple separate transmissions furnished certainty in the realm of law. Likewise, a group known as the Dariya is associated both with such views and with India, although the latter connection is very tenuous. While the circumstances under which these groups appeared in Islamic literature in these particular forms are well outside the scope of this article, their presence is indicative of considerably closer connections to India in the formative period of Islam than during Muhammad's time. None of these groups is mentioned in the Quran. Any assumption of familiarity with these groups on the part of the earliest Muslims betrays back projection. Another important Buddhist contribution to Islamic and Islamicate culture is a text mentioned earlier in the Fihriст, where Ibn al-Nadim lists a book with the title Balawar wa Buddha Saif. This is the Arabic title of a version of the life of the Buddha which enjoyed great popularity in different languages of medieval Western Eurasia. The story of the Buddha, whether through the book of Balawar and Buddha Saif or otherwise, is sometimes claimed to have left a trace in the Sufi tradition, namely in the story of Ibrahim ibn Adham. Like Siddhartha Gautama, Ibrahim is reported to have been born as a prince, but then sought the life of an ascetic. In traditions about this early renunciant, Ibrahim encounters a mysterious man by the name of Khidr, a sort of immortal prophet especially popular in the Sufi tradition. Khidr too is associated with the Buddha in traditions independent of Ibrahim ibn Adham al-Shahrastani instance, stated that in the Islamic tradition only Khidr compared to the Buddha. The similarities between early Muslim and Buddhist renunciants are such that they have given rise to theories about Buddhist or Indian origins of Sufism. Even if individual Muslim renunciant movements were inspired or influenced by Buddhist traditions, however, the origins of Muslim asceticism are certainly more complex. The same applies to theories that attribute the canonization of hadiths to similar Buddhist tendencies. Conclusions. Whenever historians approach sources which play an important role in the salvation history of a particular religion, certain concerns are regularly part of their analytical toolbox. One of them involves entanglements of this particular religion with other religions. Historical narratives of a religious tradition might downplay the significance of another religion or even edit it out in order to enhance claims of originality and superhuman validation. On the other hand, the presence or significance of another religion might be exaggerated, for example in order to indeed downplay that of another religion, or in order to emphasize certain features of one's own religion. Monotheism in a polytheistic environment, for example. As interest in cultural contacts and connected histories has grown, so has the awareness that no religion emerges in a vacuum. However, representations of the religious, cultural, social and political environment in which a given religion emerged usually reflect doctrinal tendencies that develop in subsequent years. This is as true of Islam as of any other religion. Among modern authors, views concerning the sectarian milieu in which Islam emerged differ widely, as mentioned above. While some historians basically accept the premises of the Islamic tradition and locate Muhammad's prophetic mission in a polytheistic environment in which idolatry was part of religious practice, others understand the polemics against associators as a trope of intra-monotheistic discourse. The views surveyed in this article occupy a curious position in this field. On the one hand, they present a significant challenge to conventional narratives of the religious landscape in which Islam emerged. One might call this the challenge to the Islamic tradition. On the other hand, many of the authors who argue in favor of a Buddhist or Indian presence are fairly moderate in their source criticism. While occasionally challenging the interpretation of reports, they often take the general reliability of the tradition's historical accounts for granted and thus validate this body of textual sources.